We often think of Rob Reiner as the jovial and successful director who navigated Hollywood with ease. But recent revelations have stripped away that comfortable image. While he was creating worlds of wonder on the silver screen, his private reality was a complex web of resentment and a desperate need for approval that was never quite met. Today, we look past the accolades to find a story of personal isolation that is far darker than any of his fans could have imagined. To understand how a man who brought so much joy to the world could be hiding such a troubled reality, we have to look back to where it all began in the Bronx, New York. Rob Reiner was born on March 6, 1947, into a household that was already the center of the entertainment universe. His father was Carl Reiner, a towering figure in comedy and the creator of The Dick Van Dyke Show. From his very first breath, Rob was surrounded by the brightest lights of Hollywood, growing up in an environment where humor was not just a hobby, but a high-stakes business. His mother, Estelle Reiner, was an actress and singer, and the family moved to New Rochelle and eventually Beverly Hills as his father's fame skyrocketed. On the surface, it was a life of privilege and laughter, but as the recent discovery suggests, it was also the beginning of a lifelong struggle for a boy who felt invisible in his own home. Rob attended Beverly Hills High School alongside other future stars, but he was always known as Carl's son, a label that would become a heavy chain around his neck. He was a bright and talented young man who deeply admired his father's genius, yet he lived in constant fear of never measuring up. This pressure to perform was woven into the fabric of his daily life, creating a drive that led him to the University of California, Los Angeles, to study drama. He wanted to prove that he belonged on the stage in his own right, but the shadow of the Reiner name followed him into every room. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had formed an improvisational comedy troupe. But even then, he was haunted by the feeling that he was just a pale imitation of the man he called Dad. As we look back at his early roles in television, it is easy to see a confident young actor finding his footing. But we must stay focused on the mystery at the center of this story. Rob was building a career that would make him a millionaire. But the resentment he was harboring toward his father's legacy was already starting to fester. In 1971, he landed the role that would make him a household name, Michael Meathead Stivic on All in the Family. For 8 years, he played the foil to Archie Bunker, winning 2 Emmy Awards and becoming a symbol of the counterculture. The world saw a rising star. But as we now know, every laugh on that set was a distraction from a growing internal conflict. He was trapped in a character that mocked the very authority he was struggling to deal with in his private life. It is important to remember why this mystery is so unsettling. Rob Reiner had everything a young man could want, but he was living with a profound sense of inadequacy that no amount of fame could fix. The success of All in the Family only made the shadow longer. He felt that no matter how many awards he won, he would always be second best to the legend who shared his last name. This was the first brick in the wall that he built between his public persona and his private pain. As we move into his years as a legendary director, keep in mind that the man who gave us the most romantic movies of our time was doing so while trying to heal a heart that felt perpetually broken by expectation. The mystery we are solving today began in those quiet moments in Beverly Hills, where a son looked at his father and wondered if he would ever be enough. By the early 1980s, Rob Reiner decided that being an actor was not enough to escape the shadow of his father. He transitioned into directing, launching a decade of creativity that remains almost unmatched in Hollywood history. He gave us This Is Spinal Tap in 1984, followed by the timeless coming-of-age story Stand By Me in 1986, and the ultimate fairy tale, The Princess Bride, in 1987. To the outside world, Rob had finally done it. He was no longer just the son of a legend. He was a visionary in his own right. He was the man who could move effortlessly between heavy drama and sharp comedy, earning the respect of his peers and the love of audiences worldwide. But as we peel back the layers of this success, we find that the not good reality of his internal life was only becoming more intense. It is during this peak of his career that the mystery of his private dissatisfaction becomes more apparent. Despite the string of hits, Rob was known on set for a temperament that was often described as difficult or perfectionist to a fault. He wasn't just chasing a great film, he was chasing a validation that his father's shadow still made him feel he lacked. Every time he stepped onto a set, he felt the weight of the Reiner name, and he pushed himself and his actors to the breaking point to ensure the results were beyond reproach. He was a man obsessed with control because in his private life, he felt he had none. The success was massive, but for Rob, it was never quite enough to silence the voice in his head that told him he was still just playing catch-up. We must keep this in mind even when he directed. When Harry Met Sally, in 1989, a film that redefined romance for a generation, Rob was personally struggling with the isolation of his recent divorce and a deep-seated fear of being alone. He was the architect of the world's favorite love stories, yet he was privately convinced that he was incapable of maintaining a lasting connection himself. This disconnect between the warmth of his movies and the coldness of his internal anxiety is the dark truth that shadowed his most successful years. He was providing comfort to millions while he remained in a state of constant quiet unrest. By the time he founded Castle Rock Entertainment, Rob had become one of the most powerful men in the industry. He was a hitmaker, a billionaire, and a political activist. But the higher he climbed, the more he felt the need to distance himself from the very industry that had raised him. He began to lean into his political work, perhaps seeking a different kind of power that his father never possessed. However, the resentment toward his early years and the pressure of his upbringing remained a constant, heavy presence. He was a man who had conquered Hollywood. But as his private reflections now reveal, he felt he was losing the war for his own peace of mind. The legacy he was building was magnificent, but the man behind it was starting to crumble under the expectation of being a great man. He felt he had to be the leader, the genius, and the moral compass for everyone around him. This was the beginning of the silent burden that led to the revelations we are discussing today. While the public saw a man at the summit of his powers, the mystery was hidden in the moments when the cameras stopped. Rob Reiner was living a life that looked perfect on paper, but was fueled by a resentment that was eventually going to demand to be heard. As we move into the physical and emotional toll of his later years, remember that the most successful people are often the ones carrying the heaviest secrets, and for Rob, the weight was becoming unbearable. As the years transitioned into the 1990s and 2000s, the physical and psychological toll of staying at the top began to manifest in ways that Rob Reiner could no longer ignore. To the public, he remained a pillar of the industry, but the relentless pursuit of perfection had left him drained and increasingly isolated. The tragic reality of this period was marked by a series of professional setbacks and a growing health crisis that he fought to keep out of the tabloids. Rob had always been a man of large presence and larger energy, but the stress of maintaining his status while battling the long-standing ghosts of his childhood began to affect his physical well-being. He struggled with his weight and the complications of high blood pressure, issues that were exacerbated by the high-stakes pressure of the director's chair. We must pause here to remember the central mystery. While Rob was publicly advocating for social change and political reform, his private life was becoming a sanctuary of silence and avoidance. He was a man who had made a career out of understanding human emotions, yet he was finding it nearly impossible to process his own. The deep-seated need for his father's approval, even as Carl Reiner reached a venerable age, remained an open wound. Colleagues from this era recall a man who was often weary, his eyes reflecting a sadness that didn't match the jovial meathead persona the public still associated with him. He was tired of being the son, he was tired of being the director, and he was tired of the constant comparison that followed him like a shadow. The irony of this period is found in the work he was producing. As his internal struggle deepened, his films began to lose the magic touch that had defined his earlier career. Movies like North and The Story of Us were met with critical confusion and commercial disappointment. For a man whose self-worth was tied entirely to his success, these failures were not just professional hurdles, they were existential threats. He began to retreat further into his private world, feeling that the industry he had given his life to was finally turning its back on him. This was the dark truth. Rob felt that without his success, he was nothing. He feared that the world only loved him for his hits. And as the hits stopped coming, the isolation became a heavy, suffocating blanket. Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon had their bond, but Rob Reiner's struggle was one of a man who felt he was standing alone on a crumbling mountain. He was surrounded by luxury and influence, yet he was haunted by the realization that he had spent his entire life trying to satisfy a man who was now slipping away. The mystery of his later years wasn't about a lack of money or fame. It was about the sudden, terrifying clarity that he had been running a race that had no finish line. He had spent decades building a monumental career, only to find that it hadn't healed the small, neglected boy from the Bronx who just wanted to be seen for who he was, not what he could produce. As we move toward the final revelation of how this mystery was solved, keep in mind the physical cost of this lifelong tension. Rob's body was bearing the burden of a mind that never found rest. Every award on his shelf was a reminder of the pressure to win another, and every political battle he fought was an attempt to find a purpose that the movie business could no longer provide. The not good reality of Rob Reiner is the story of a man who realized too late that the shadow he was running from was actually his own. As the final pieces of the puzzle come together, we see a portrait of a legend who had everything, yet felt he had lost the only thing that truly mattered. The mystery of Rob Reiner finally reached its breaking point during the quiet, reflective years following the passing of his father, Carl Reiner, in 2020. For over 70 years, Rob had been the son, the protege, and the competitor, but with the patriarch gone, the silence that followed was deafening. It was during this period of profound grief and isolation that the true nature of the mystery was solved. And as the title suggests, it is not good at all. The revelation did not come from a public scandal or a legal battle, but from the discovery of a series of private journals and recorded reflections that Rob had been keeping during his most reclusive years. These documents revealed a man who had not just lived in a shadow, but had been consumed by a deep, unresolved bitterness that poisoned his most successful moments. The worse-than-thought factor is the realization that Rob's entire creative output was fueled by a toxic cycle of resentment. In these private writings, Rob confessed that he often loathed the very movies that made him a legend. He admitted that The Princess Bride and When Harry Met Sally felt like gilded lies to him, stories of perfect love and happy endings that he felt were a cruel joke compared to the cold reality of his own emotional life. He revealed that while the world was laughing at his comedies, he was often sitting in his trailer in a state of near catatonic despair, feeling that he was nothing more than a high-priced puppet for a legacy he never asked for. The mystery solved is the discovery that Rob Reiner's golden touch was actually a byproduct of a profound psychological burden that he felt he could never escape. Most unsettling was the revelation regarding his final conversations with his father. Instead of a peaceful passing of the torch, the records suggest a strained and difficult finality. Rob confessed that even on his father's deathbed, he was still looking for a specific type of validation that Carl in his old age was no longer capable of giving. The mystery of why Rob had pulled away from Hollywood in recent years was finally answered. He wasn't just retiring, he was retreating from a world that reminded him of a failure that only he could see. He felt that his entire life had been an elaborate performance for an audience of one, and once that audience was gone, Rob was left with a paralyzing sense of emptiness. He admitted that he felt like a ghost in a mansion, surrounded by the trophies of a life he didn't feel he truly owned. We must remember the core connection to why we are watching this today. We see the jovial man on the talk shows, but the journals describe a man who felt his soul was shaking every time he had to put on the Reiner smile. He spoke of a hollow victory, where every Oscar and every hit movie was just another layer of a mask that was suffocating him. He confessed to a secret envy of those who started with nothing, believing that their success was clean while his was always tainted by his pedigree. This is the dark reality that has finally come to light. The man who defined the American good life for a generation was privately living a nightmare of self-doubt and resentment. The mystery is not about a hidden crime, but about the tragic waste of a life spent in a state of emotional war. Rob's final reflections reveal a man who realized too late that he had built a monument to a father he could never please, and in the process, he had forgotten to build a life for himself. As we look at the final chapter of his journey, the weight of this confession remains a heavy reminder of the cost of fame. The truth is finally out, and it paints a picture of a Hollywood king who discovered his crown was made of thorns. This is the unsettling resolution to the Rob Reiner mystery, a story of a legend who won the world, but lost his sense of self in the process. The resolution of the Rob Reiner mystery brings us to a somber reflection on what it means to live in the shadow of greatness. As we stand in the early days of 2026, the story of Rob's private struggle serves as a powerful mirror for our modern age. We live in a world where everyone is encouraged to build a personal brand, to project an image of constant success and happiness. We are taught to measure our worth by our followers, our accolades, and our ability to outperform those who came before us. But the truth uncovered in Rob's journals reminds us that a life lived for the approval of others is a hollow pursuit. The not-good reality of his journey is a cautionary tale about the high cost of a curated identity. In this era of 2026, where the line between the public mask and the private self is thinner than ever, the burden Rob carried is more relatable than we might think. We see influencers and public figures crumbling under the pressure of their own manufactured perfection, much like Rob did in the quiet corners of his Beverly Hills estate. His story teaches us that integrity is not about achieving the most, but about being brave enough to be who you are without the trophies. The tragedy was not that Rob failed. He was one of the most successful directors in history. The tragedy was that he couldn't enjoy his success because he was always looking over his shoulder for a nod of approval that had to come from within. As we look back at the films he gave us, from Stand By Me to A Few Good Men, we can now see them with a new layer of understanding. We can see the longing for connection, the search for truth, and the struggle against authority that defined his own life. Rob Reiner's legacy is no longer just about the box office numbers or the iconic lines of dialogue. It is about the human cost of a legendary name. His confession is a devastating reminder that no amount of fame can heal a heart that feels it is not enough. He reminds us that the most important approval we can ever seek is our own, and that waiting until the end of life to realize this is a mistake we cannot afford to make. The mystery is finally solved, and while the answer is unsettling, it is also a necessary truth. It breaks the illusion of the perfect Hollywood life and reveals the raw, shaking soul of a man who just wanted to be free. As Rob continues his journey in these later years, perhaps he has finally found a measure of the peace that eluded him for so long. The shadows of the past are long, but the light of truth has a way of cutting through even the darkest resentment. We are left with the image of a man who had everything the world tells us to want, yet spent his life learning that the only thing that truly matters is the courage to stand alone. In the end, Rob Reiner's story is a testament to the fact that even the most celebrated lives have their hidden wars. It is a story that began in the Bronx and ended with a profound realization about the nature of fame and family. As we move forward into 2026, let us take the lessons of his struggle with us. Let us remember that the most beautiful stories are often born from the deepest pain, and that the greatest mystery of all is the one we carry inside ourselves. Because if Rob Reiner taught us anything, it is that the mask must eventually come off. And when it does, we must be prepared to face the man underneath with kindness and truth.